In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made this A-frame porch swing stand. Let's get into the process. I started off by flipping out the wings on my miter saw stand and cutting down the material that will make up the 4 legs. If you would like a set of plans with a cut list and material list, I have that link for you down below. After cutting the angle on the bottom of the leg, I went to the top and used a template to trace the needed top profile. By the way, a template for the shape comes with a set of plans. After tracing the shape, I used a bandsaw to cut it out. It can be a little tricky to do this with a bandsaw because of the length, so grab a friend if you're able to. If not, a jigsaw would also work. After I got one of the legs fully cut on top and bottom, I used it to trace the different cuts on the remaining 3 legs and then repeated with the cutting process. With this project being so large, I find it easiest to work directly on the floor of my shop instead of a workbench. I laid out all 4 legs and the orientation they would end up, then started marking the locations of the stretchers. These are the pieces that will span from leg to leg. To make a cleaner looking finished project and also a stronger connection, I decided to make these half-lap joints. I measured up from the end of the leg on all 4, then making sure the top profile cut was touching, I pulled out a tape measure to the dimension the bottom splay needed to be, then made sure the legs were positioned as far apart as they should be. Now that the legs were staged in their final position, I grabbed the bottom stretcher and simply set it in place directly on top of the legs. Here, I made sure the board landed on my pencil marks on both legs, then used a pencil to mark the top and also the bottom. This will indicate where the half flaps on the legs needs to be cut in. Then before moving the board, I went to the underside and also marked the stretcher the same, which will indicate where the half flap is needed on the stretcher. Now on to making all of the half flaps. To do this, you want to set the depth of your saw to half the overall depth of your material. Then you take out half the material at the connection on both boards before joining them together. If you go the same route as me and use a circular saw, then a quick method is to make multiple cuts with the saw where the material needs to be removed. Then break out the pieces and clean up the bottom. I typically use a chisel to just bend over the pieces until the majority break off and then chisel up the bottom flush. But a claw and a hammer also works. After knocking out one, I would set the part back into place on the floor and then repeat on the next one. By the way, if you want to simplify this project, you can actually skip the half flaps and just face screw the stretchers to the inside of the frame. However, half flaps do give it a pretty tidy look at the end. If you go the half flap route, I always take my time making the first 2 cuts to establish the boundary of the joint, then zoom away to cut out the inside cuts. I always recommend dry fitting your pieces before applying glue, so this is just a dry run for me. As you can see, the stretcher is still left long at this point. Okay, good to go. I hauled the stretcher over to the miter saw to cut it to length. After repeating for the top stretcher, I started adding glue and actually attaching things. Since this is an outdoor project, be sure to use a waterproof wood glue on any joints. I applied a good amount and then slipped in the stretchers. Don't be afraid to use a mallet to work it into position. It should be a tight joint. I attached things using 3 outdoor rated screws per connection. However, if you wanted an upgrade, 2 bolts on each location would be a good choice. Okay, let's stand up the 2 ends and connect the 2. This step is certainly easier to call in a friend for help. After roughly placing both ends, I held one end of the beam in its socket while David, who is actually the manager of the woodshed but doing some work in my shop, moved in the other leg so that it could also be cradled. Once it's up there, I climbed up to get it snugly seated all the way down and then attached it. The thing to pay attention to here is I left the beam a little long so there would be a nice overhang on either end. So I just had to make sure that the distance of the overhang was correct before I drove in the screws in the legs. I placed screws in from both sides, but again, bolts would be an upgraded option here. I moved over to the other side and repeated. This side didn't nest down all the way as easily, but it's nothing a big Bessie clamp couldn't solve. Perfect, let's move on. Now to the inside of the frame. I first cut, then added in some gussets. These are a small part compared to everything else on the build, but they are important to keep the entire frame from being able to rack left and right. I quickly cut both sides to the needed angle, then lined them up to the center of the header and the top stretcher. And just a tip for you, I always try and get some screws started in my board when I know I'll only have one hand available for securing. Gussets are added, which adds rigidity, so let's add the swing and give it a test run. We aren't done yet, but I'm too impatient to wait. I added in some eyelets to the top header beam, then hung up my swing. If you're needing a swing as well, then check out my website as I have templates for making this one. Over the years, I have built plenty of these two-seaters and even did an alternative one-person design. I just want the freedom of being able to swing my feet. Thank you very much. Okay, let's add on 2 more additions. There is some built-in wasted space on frames. To put it to some sort of use, I built in some little end tables, if you will. I started by making a few half-lap joints in this bottom stretcher, then holding a 2x4 in place to trace out the profile. This gave me the area I needed to take away to make a matching arm. I cut the waist out over at the bandsaw and then glued these pieces into place. Next, I cut up and sanded a few pickets to make the top deck boards. After lining them up, I secured them into place with screws. And I didn't glue these just so I can easily replace them in the future should I need to. Honestly, I don't know if these will be handy or not. My porch swing does come with a cup holder in both arms, which seems to be the most valuable to me. But who knows, maybe I'll want to carve a spoon while swinging and be able to use the end tables for my tools. Or maybe even just a Bluetooth speaker for music. Okay, last detail, a top cap. This is really just for aesthetics, but I do think it gives the frame a more complete look. After sanding down a board, I cut it to length and then used a few screws to secure it to the top of the beam. And that is the frame done. It can be a bit awkward to move this big heavy thing, but it definitely can be done with 2 people. Or keep in mind that you could always build it in place. I placed mine out in front of my shop so I have a nice place to go and take a call or even just relax at the end of the day. If you're interested in other frame designs, I built a different style of porch swing frame a few years ago that has a roof on it to provide some shade. I'll leave you a link to all the things I've mentioned in the description of the video for you to check out. If you purchase a set of plans or templates from me, then I just want to say a big thank you for supporting what I do. I will see you on whatever I'm building next. If you have been wanting to make a rocking chair, then I have templates for this design right here. Or if you go to my website, I have templates for tons of other projects as well.